Hi, welcome to our lecture on how governments affect population change, also known as pro and anti-natalist policies. The slides were designed to accompany the book The Cultural Landscape, and the lecture is by myself, Chris Gall. We start off talking about population and government, and we talk about population policies. There's really kind of two extremes we can talk about. And the first one is what are called expansive population policies. And these are policies that are specifically designed to encourage larger families and to raise the rate of natural increase. At the other end of the spectrum, we have what are called eugenic population policies. And these are population policies that are designed to limit the population in some kind of an extreme way. Generally speaking, limit the population of a specific racial or cultural group and to privilege them over others. We see this a little bit today. It's not as prevalent as it was, say, in the early part of the 20th century, but it does still happen in some places. Most countries, however, fall in between and they adopt either restrictive population policies or they adopt expansive population policies and then run into some restrictions. And then there's just some areas of the world that really are kind of contradictory, that do things that you wouldn't expect. Okay, so when we talk about restrictive population policies, probably the most famous and one you absolutely need to know for the AP exam is the one-child policy in China. And in a nutshell, the way the one-child policy works is this. When you get married, you register. And when you're ready to have a child, you go and you get a certificate that gives you permission to have one child. If you end up having more than one child, you pay significant fines, and it can have an adverse impact on your career, your housing, the schooling for your children, all kinds of things. So technically it's against the law to have more than one child in China, but there are ways to kind of circumvent it. Okay. And one of those ways is just to pay the fines and the fees, which certainly some people do. They are pretty heavy though. They're typically somewhere in the neighborhood of 1 to 2 years' salary, depending on exactly where you're at in the country. If you're in the countryside, so you're not in the cities, and you want to have a second child if your first child was a daughter, sometimes they can get exceptions made for that, because there's a real preference for boys. Otherwise, the only other way really to go about it is to have your child off the books. And by off the books, I mean that you have the child outside of a hospital, typically at home, that your child doesn't have proper birth certificate and registration paperwork, and so they then can't gain access to things like schooling or health care. They can't get a job because technically they don't exist, right? All kinds of things like that. And these days, right, China's been so successful with their shrinking their TFR that it's somewhere, I think, in the neighborhood of like 1.6, 1.7, I think was the last number I'd heard, something like that. So their population's actually peaking pretty much right now, and then it's going to start going down a little bit. That they're loosening up the policy. It's been so successful that they've loosened up the policy a bit, and counterintuitively, you would have expected births to increase as soon as they said people could have more births, but their propaganda campaign has been so successful in terms of encouraging people to have only one child that they actually have not, they didn't see the flood of births that they were expecting. Okay, so some of the countries that run up against some limitations. So Sweden, Western Europe, right, and specifically it's one of the Nordic countries, so their birth rates are very low. They're very highly developed. And what they have done is tried to encourage families. And part of the way that they have done that is they have very generous parental leave policies. So if you have a child or you adopt a child, you get somewhere in the neighborhood. I think the last number I'd heard was 2 years off just to stay home and be with the child. And that's either father or mother or both gets that time. They provide subsidies for children there. They provide free childcare once you go back to work. All kinds of things to try and encourage population growth, and to some limited degree they've been successful, but by and large what you end up seeing is that population might grow for a little bit and then we hit a bump in the road, say the economy turns down, and it goes right back down. So they've not been overly successful. So there have been some limitations in really how successful pro-natal policies can be. Anti-natal policies tend to be very successful, but reversing that trend can be very, very difficult, if not downright impossible. Some of the interesting things you see when we talk about like contradictions are the Roman Catholic Church and its doctrine. And if you're not familiar, the Roman Catholic Church preaches that you should have as many children as you have, that you should not use birth control, you should not use any kind of birth control really, and that you have the number you have. And so what you see is really kind of interesting. Some Roman Catholic countries have gone so far, like say in the Philippines, to where a lot of types of birth control have been outlawed. And then you get other countries that are predominantly Roman Catholic, especially say in Central and South America, where lots of types of birth control are not outlawed, but at the extreme end, things like abortion are very tightly controlled. And so you see, for the most part, birth rates are not as influenced by that as you might expect. Given how much sway the Catholic Church ends up having in a lot of those countries in terms of laws and belief systems and things like that, it's actually birth rates tend to much more closely follow and track levels of development than they do pretty much anything else. So just to take a look at the effect of some of these anti-natalist policies, right? We've got a couple of population pyramids here from China. One from 2010 on the left and one from 2050 on the right, and a few things to just in general draw your attention to. One is you'll notice that on the left we've got approximately kind of a bell shape, right? So population numbers they've kind of roughly leveled off. We see a few big generations and a few spots where it went way out and then back down, right, where they were kind of, for lack of a better term, fluke years. What you also see as you look at the top of the pyramid, and you see this actually on both pyramids, is that more women live longer than men. And that's typical across pretty much every country. Women tend to live longer than men. Mostly because, don't take this the wrong way, guys, especially when you're younger, you tend to make not as many smart choices, for lack of a better term. You take more risks, and that results in a shorter overall life expectancy. And then as you get older, men are more likely to suffer from chronic diseases and things like that. And so they actually die off quickly at the other end of the scale as well. If we look at the 2050 population pyramid, what you notice is it's almost like that bell's inverted. Okay, so our population growth rate is significantly declined. And you'll notice that only about roughly 4%, well, roughly 8% of the population, if you include both males and females, now is in that 0 to 4 range, K0 to 4 basically being infant and toddlerhood, as opposed to in the 2010 pyramid, it was more like 6 or 12%. So it's a pretty big drop. We're talking about percentages. And what you'll notice if you look at the very top, right? So 2010, we're looking at maybe 3% of people are living to be 80 years and beyond. By 2050, they're expecting that number to actually be more like 14 or 15%. Okay, so stop and think about what that means for a country in terms of their development, in terms of resource use and things like that for just a sec. If you're interested in learning a little more about population growth numbers and a little bit maybe about population policies, I would strongly recommend the video 200 Countries, 200 Years, 4 Minutes. It's Hans Rosling who did the video we watched in class about Don't Panic that talked about population. And he's really an entertaining guy to watch, and he really does run you through some of the demographic data on one of those great big graphs, similar to what you saw in the video. If you have any questions or concerns, please feel free to swing by and see me and ask your questions, and I'd love to hear them. And otherwise, I guess I'll see you later.